Hello, and welcome back to another historical video, this time about the fighting in Arnhem during Operation Market Garden, as portrayed in the game Post Scriptum. Operation Market Garden was the ambitious plan of British Field Marshal Montgomery to create an invasion line into northern Germany by creating a salient from southern Belgium into the Netherlands. To achieve this, paratroopers would be dropped at 9 different bridges. They would conquer and hold them, this was Operation Market, until the ground forces would reach them over land and support them. This would be Operation Garden. Market was to be carried out by the 1st Allied Airborne Army and Garden by 30 Corps of the British 2nd Army. The northernmost bridge was the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem, and the map in Post Scriptum portrays the fighting in the bridge area. During Market Garden, there were several locations in Arnhem where fighting was fierce. For example, at St. Elisabeth Gasthuis, St. Elizabeth Hospital, but they are in a different area of Arnhem. So this video, according to the map, will focus on the fighting in the bridge area. The Allied unit present is the 2nd Parachute Battalion led by John Frost, which was part of the 1st Airborne Division, led by Roy Urquhart. In-game, the British are portrayed as the 1st Airborne Division because they also play parts on maps like Oosterbeek and Hilsum. The Axis units present are the 9th SS Hohenstaufen, led by Standartenführer Walter Hatzer, and 10th SS Frundsberg, led by Brigadeführer Heinz Hamel, of which the previous is portrayed in Post Scriptum. Together they form the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, led by Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Dietrich. On the 17th of September, the Allied landings west of Arnhem took place, and while the Germans were very much surprised by this attack, they quickly understood what the target of the operation was. We are looking at it right now. So they prepared their units to form a defensive blocking line west of Arnhem to prevent Allied units from entering the city and reach the bridge. The Allies had prepared several routes into the city, and the southernmost, codenamed Lion, was taken by Frost's battalion, and they reached the bridge in the evening at around 8 p.m. We just walked a part of route Lion, and of course the British didn't walk all the way from the landing zone, they used their jeeps. A German guard was heard by a citizen of Arnhem screaming, "I am all alone!" because he realized that the enemy was approaching. Major Digby Tutton-Water, commander of A Company, held his troops below the bridge, so the German traffic continued like they weren't there. He sent 2 platoons to the flanks in order to prepare some of the nearby houses for defense. Corporals and sergeants knocked on doors politely to tell the inhabitants what their orders were, and they recommended the Dutch people to evacuate in order to not get involved in the fighting. Preparing the houses meant filling the bathtubs and sinks with water in case of a disruption of the water supply, and preparing barricades inside the houses. Some of the men secretly enjoyed smashing windows and breaking down doors to barricade the buildings. Barricades in-game are mostly made of sandbags, like right here. Those men were enjoying it because they knew they could get away with it, and they felt like little boys smashing or trashing a house. Not much to trash here. Frost met up with Tutton-Water, and they were checking out how they could get to the southern end of the bridge. They had to conclude it wasn't possible at that moment because the railway bridge got blown up by the Germans and the pontoon bridge was taken down. They couldn't find any boats to cross, so they focused on taking the north end first. The first attempt failed because the British were fired at by an armored car and 20mm AA position, which was on the southern side of the bridge. The second attempt went better, but with a bit of luck. There was a soldier with a flamethrower, and he was trying to take out that bunker over there. So he was firing at the bunker, and at the very moment he was firing, he got distracted by someone tapping on his shoulder. And he overshot the bunker, so the flames went over the bunker, and they went into that shed over there. The shed must have had ammo stored because it exploded in a huge fireball, making it difficult for a group of German trucks to pass over the bridge, and as a result they got shot up by the paratroopers. And here, this is a nice little detail in the map. Here's the shed, and it indeed has some ammo stored, so the mapper of this map assumed that it was indeed the case that there was ammo stored in this shed. So here was the huge fireball, and the trucks that approached from the southern end, they got blown up, and the wrecks of the trucks were littered over the bridge over here. One of the engineers which was present at the bridge talked to Frost, and he said that the heat of the wiring of the detonation explosives must have melted, because the Germans didn't blow up the road bridge when they were there. Actually, the German General Model wanted to keep the bridge intact in order to be able to do a fast counterattack from the north towards Nijmegen in the south, if necessary. Dietrich, the commander of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, knew that only a small part of the British Airborne Division had actually reached the bridge. So he ordered the Hohenstaufen to set up defensive lines to prevent any more British soldiers from entering the city of Arnhem. The Frundsberg was ordered to attack the bridge and destroy Frost's forces so they could reinforce the defenses of Nijmegen in the south. They entered the Palace of Justice, overlooking the Walburgstraat and the Marktplein, the market square, which we are looking at right now, and set up machine guns in defensive positions. This here is the location of the Palace of Justice, and I say location because the building in reality looks rather different. It actually looks like this. In Post Scriptum, you attack the bridge as the 9th SS Hohenstaufen, and in reality the attack was performed by the 10th SS Frundsberg. But this can be explained because, like the British, the SS unit features on more than one map. In the early morning of the 18th of September, the radio man of Frost's unit discovered that the telephone they had brought with them didn't work, so he threw it against a wall, cursing its existence. This was just one example of failing communications all over Operation Market Garden, not only at the bridge, but during the entire battle. The British resorted to ancient forms of communications with hand signals and bugle tones. Actually, Major Digby Tatum Water had practiced this with his unit because he was wary of the ability of the radios to work properly, and rightly so. At 9 a.m. a column of about 20 vehicles lined up on the southern end of the bridge. They belonged to Hohenstaufen's recon battalion, led by Sturmbannführer Grebner, wearing the Ritterkreuz which he had received the day before. Puma armored cars at the head of the column. In this case we have another armored car being the placeholder for them. Hanomag APCs right after, as you can see in the little column on the bridge right now. And in the rear several trucks with soldiers. They raced across the bridge in order to surprise the paratroopers. A British signalman shouted, "Armored cars crossing the bridge!" Frost thought for a second that it might be the front guard of the 30 Corps, but these hopes were soon crushed. The paratroopers watched the first 4 Pumas race over their AT mine lines, which they had placed on the bridge. They had expected them to blow up, but that didn't happen. So afterwards they opened fire with rifles, machine guns and machine pistols on everything else. In the chaos of trying to get past the burning trucks from before, remember they were next to that bunker over there, and the shooting of the paratroopers, Grebner's column got wiped. Some trucks tried to get away, but they crashed into the school building on the eastern side of the bridge. That's over there. And others went overboard and landed on the road alongside the river beneath the bridge. The few infantry soldiers who managed to get out of their vehicles before grenades landed in them were mown down by the rifle and MG fire. None of the Germans survived the attack, including Grebner, who had worn his Ritterkreuz for only 1 day. In-game, you attack as the Germans from the south, which is the historical route the Grebner column took. The difference with reality is that the other German attacks came from the north, including the ones with the Tiger tanks, which I will tell about later. In the city of Arnhem, people didn't know what was going on, and when they got out for groceries, they soon returned pale as a sheet because of their terror of what they saw. The Germans were convinced that the tower of the Eusebiuskerk, or the Grote Kerk, was used as an observation post for the British, so they kept firing at it, even with a Pak-40 AT gun, damaging the tower heavily. So what we can see here on the map is the church undamaged, which it was until the fighting began in Arnhem. The same was the case for the Walburgis church, which was closer to the bridge, and the Germans also fired at those spires. In reality it had 2 spires. In game there's a church which resembles the Walburgis church a bit, but it has only 1 spire. And like the Grote Kerk, it's undamaged like it was before the battle began. On the 18th of September, most of the fighting in Arnhem occurred around the St. Elizabeth Hospital. Only near the end of the afternoon, the fighting at the bridge intensified again. 10th SS Recon Battalion joined the fight, and during the evening the Germans succeeded in setting fire to the school building on the eastern slope of the bridge. This school was called the Van Limburg-Stierum School, and in reality its location is somewhere around here. In game you can see there's a building which is obviously not a school building. It has a sign which says Deutsches Dienstpostamt Arnhem, which means German Postal Service Arnhem. If you look closely in the city you will see several of these buildings, which probably means that the German soldiers were sending a lot of postal cards to the Heimat. But jokes aside, this is a shop building and it has several signs of cocoa and for a sign for meat, where you can buy chicken and wildfowl, and it has a sign for beer. It says Aastal beer, which is probably a copyright thing because in reality there was a brand called Amstel beer and it existed in the 40s, so that could be very well the case that they are pointing towards that brand of beer. So this building is on the location of the school building, but in reality the school looked like this. The paratroopers had to use fire extinguishers and their own jump jackets to fight the fire, in which they finally succeeded in the middle of the night. During that same night, the Germans had forcefully evacuated all civilians of Arnhem on the area around the northern end of the bridge. This was in preparation of the attack by dawn, which began on the 19th of September. The Frundsberg focused on demolishing the school building. They used some panzers to accomplish this. While one of the panzers got taken out by engineers, the crew abandoned the vehicle and crept up to the school building, only to get blown up by a grenade that was dropped from a window above them. Fighting was intense. One engineer went out of the building screaming, "We're all gonna die!" Everyone screamed at him in order to make him return, but he was already too far off and wandered directly into the German firing line. The defenders in the school were hoping for 30 Corps to appear, and some of them had hallucinations of them coming over the bridge, probably an effect of the benzodrine they had been given by some of their commanding officers. German snipers were aiming at the school building, so the British were wrapping their feet in cloth in order to not make any sound, because that would give away their position to the snipers. Around noon, a heavier attack on brigade headquarters began, supported by 20mm AA from the other riverbank. This was taken out by the American OSS Lieutenant Harvey Todd. He took out the crew of the AA with a Bren gun he had taken from a fallen gunner in the house he was in. The Germans even sent in air support, and a Focke-Wulf 190 came from the south, dropped a bomb on the Eusebius Bindesingel, but it was a dud. The engineers in the school opened fire with Bren guns, and the pilot tilted the plane to dodge the shots, but he hit the church tower in the west. It must have been the church tower of the Grote Kerk. With his wingtip, and the plane crashed in a huge fireball. A loud "Wah, Mohammed!" rose up from all the buildings around the north end of the bridge. This was the battle cry of the 1st Airborne Division, adopted in North Africa when they first participated in the action during Operation Torch. In brigade headquarters, the location of brigade headquarters was over here, and this building somewhat looks like it. It was also white. In reality, the brigade headquarters looked like this. In this building there were about 50 casualties. The medic would call in Father Egan, the battalion padre, when one of the Catholic soldiers was about to die. One of them said in his last words, "And to think I'd be afraid my parachute wouldn't open." Harvey Todd and the Dutch captain Jacobus Groenewoud, both members of the Jetberg team, ran to a house close by to try and call the St. Elizabeth Hospital. Their own line was dead, and while on their way to the house, Groenewoud got killed by a sniper. Todd managed to call the hospital, but they told him they could not send an ambulance because the Germans had warned they would shoot any ambulance, and all roads towards the hospital were in their hands. Upon returning, Todd learned that 30 Corps still hadn't conquered Nijmegen. Late in the morning, the Germans started attacking the school with Panzerfausts, and while they thought they had taken out the defenders, they moved up towards the school building. Everyone inside used 2 grenades, and afterwards they picked up their arms to finish off what was left of the Germans. According to Mackay, there was a field grey carpet around the school. Mackay was one of those commanders whose men thought that he knew no fear. Another remarkable commander was Digby Tatham Water, who walked around carrying an umbrella. He later revealed he was carrying the umbrella because he could never remember the password, and it would be quite obvious to anyone that the bloody fool carrying the umbrella could only be an Englishman. During the battle, Father Egan was trying to cross to a building on the other side of the street to visit the wounded in its cellar. He made an attempt to move over, but was forced to seek shelter from intense mortar fire. He then noticed Digby Tatham Water casually approaching him. The major opened his old and battered umbrella and held it over Egan's head, beckoning him, "Come on, Padre." Egan drew Tatham Water's attention to all the mortars exploding everywhere, to which came the reply, "Don't worry, I've got an umbrella." Shortly afterwards, Lieutenant Pat Barnett was sprinting over an open area he had been ordered to hold when he caught sight of Digby visiting men who were defending the sector, holding his opened umbrella over his head. Barnett was so surprised he stopped dead in his tracks and suggested to the major, "That thing won't do you much good," to which Digby replied, after staring at him with exaggerated shock, "Oh my goodness, Pat, what if it rains?" The German losses on the 19th kept rising, so Brigadeführer Hamel was glad they received some armored support, meaning the 102nd Sturmgeschützbrigade and Company Hummel from the 506th Schwere Panzerabteilung with Tiger tanks. Only 2 of the Tiger tanks survived the trip from Bocholt in Germany to Arnhem, even though Bocholt is not very far from the Dutch border. These Tigers were deployed in the evening, and using high explosive grenades they slowly but steadily shot up the houses which the defenders were holding. Buildings over there, including the school, and also the buildings next to the bridge in which the defenders were holding up. During this attack, both Father Egan and Major Digby Tattenwater got injured. The Tigers could not suppress their guns to street level, so many defenders took refuge in the basements of the houses. One of the Tiger tanks got shot up by a 6-pounder AT gun. It received 2 hits. The first hit came on the commander cupola, which wounded the commander and the second crew member. The other one, following up, shattered the armor of the cupola. The second Tiger ran into mechanical trouble and had to retreat. Instead of the Tiger, howitzers and Stooks were taking over the job of bombarding the British from up close. The bombardments were so intense that several soldiers thought they were gonna die any second. A soldier who laid down, curled up in his trench in the Eusebius Binnensingel, that's that street over there, wrote that the explosions were so plentiful that they sounded like one long roll. When night fell, Hamel sent the recently arrived engineers towards the houses where the paratroopers were defending. They had flamethrowers and they set everything in their path on fire. When a house caught fire, the defenders went through small holes in the walls to the house next door, because there was no water to extinguish any fires. The fires served several purposes for the Germans. For example, they were illuminating the streets. They could clearly see British soldiers crossing the streets against the fires in the background. The city center was also ablaze. The towers of both the St. Eusebius and the St. Walburgis church were on fire. Their bells made strange sounds when they were hit by bullets. During lulls in the fighting, the inhabitants of the city of Arnhem were trying to flee the city, with the sick and the elderly on carts and in wheelbarrows. Frost realized that if the wind would change, they would get caught in a firestorm. On the morning of the 20th of September, it started to rain a little bit, but that didn't have any influence on the burning fires. The British still held, but they were running out of ammo. They didn't have a single Piat grenade left, and Frost started to think that their chances were getting smaller by the minute. Somehow the unit was convinced that the Arnhem Bridge was their bridge, and the Germans would not set foot on it. A communications officer came to tell Frost they had contact with Urquhart, which was the very first time since the landings on the 17th. Urquhart told Frost they were in trouble too. He was at that moment in Oosterbeek at Hotel Hartenstein, featured on the Oosterbeek map in Post Scriptum. Frost guaranteed Urquhart they would hold for as long as possible, but they would need more ammunition, medical supplies and water. Asking about 30 Corps, he found out Urquhart knew as little about them as he did, so he was pretty sure they would not get relieved. More and more buildings were demolished by fire and shelling, usually by both. The Germans had started using phosphorus grenades to speed up the process. A battalion of Tiger tanks arrived in Arnhem this morning and made quite a racket in the streets. But they were less than effective in the close quarter fighting in the city. Kampfgruppe Brinkmann switched to a new tactic. They used flamethrowers and panzerfausts to suppress the British and blind them with the smoke, and then moved in to take the pockets of resistance. Many prisoners were taken, most of them were wounded. Last stand on the east side of the bridge was the Van Limburg-Stirum School, which looked like Swiss cheese now. You could see daylight everywhere you looked from within the building. The Germans opened fire on it once again with the newly arrived Tiger tanks, and the building caught fire. Since there were wounded in the basement, Mackay tried to break out with the few remaining men who were on their feet, so they could surrender the school and have the wounded taken care of by the Germans. But this failed miserably, and they were all taken prisoner. Shortly after, the school was taken by the Germans, who found the wounded British in the cellar. Frost still wanted to hold on, but since they had lost all buildings close to the bridge, the Germans could take the slopes. The tanks were functioning as bulldozers, shoving aside the burning wrecks of Greepner's column. That night Frost woke up when the sun had set already, and Dr. Jimmy Logan warned Frost that their building was on fire. Frost had Major Gough make a truce with the Germans so they could hand over the wounded, while all the walking men, only about 100 left now, were relocated. When the truce started, the Germans started the evacuation of the wounded, insisting on using the British jeeps while doing so. Frost took off his insignia. Jimmy Logan walked out carrying a Red Cross flag. A shot cracked, and Logan shouted, "Cease fire! There are only wounded here!" Logan explained to the German officer that all the wounded had to be evacuated before the building would burn out or collapse. The Germans descended into the cellar, and one heavily wounded paratrooper was planning on mowing him down with his Sten gun, but he got his weapon taken away by his fellow fighters, who thus prevented a bloodbath. Frost got carried out on a stretcher and ended up next to Douglas Crowley, and he said, "Well, Doug, I'm afraid we haven't got away with it this time." "No, sir," Douglas replied, "but we gave them a damn good run for their money." While the prisoners were taken away, they saw a burning 6-pounder AT gun with the dead crew next to it. They also saw scores of dead Germans, which both shocked and pleased them. This last thing, however, incurred the wrath of some SS Panzergrenadiers, who lined up a bunch of paratroopers and called in a young soldier boy with a flamethrower. One of the paratroopers said that this would surely mean the end of them, and that they should pray. But then a German officer appeared and shouted, "Das ist verboten! Nein, nein, nein!" Reluctantly, the SS men lowered their weapons. They did recognize a resistance fighter among them, and they forced him to kneel down and shot him through the back of the head. When the truce ended, Major Digby Tatum Water took command over a few of the survivors who had left the buildings with the wounded before they were evacuated. They took new positions in the gardens, but they had a very tiny perimeter by now, and almost all buildings around them were on fire. Others tried to break through the defensive ring of the Germans in order to join the 1st Division in Oosterbeek, but only a handful ever made it. On the 21st there were still some pockets of resistance left, and the defensive platoon of Lieutenant Barnett chose to break out in order to escape being captured. The Germans were in the garden behind the burning building Barnett and his men were in, and when they stormed out with their bayonets equipped, screaming, "Wah, Mohammed!" the Germans started running away. Barnett stated that more Germans had died of terror than by bullets at that moment. They hid under the bridge during the night while German patrols went over their heads. The Panzergrenadiers were looking for survivors. One of them, Horst Weber, said it was horrible and that there were dead bodies everywhere, some trenches filled to the brim with them. He stumbled upon 2 British paratroopers who were playing dead. He turned around, aiming his pistol, and said, "Good morning, gentlemen. Shall I bring you your breakfast now?" He brought them to the church where other prisoners were held. The Germans were in a good mood after their victory, and they also tried to make conversation with the British, complimenting them with their efforts at the bridge. They shared chocolate and cigarettes, which they had found in dropped containers, which were meant for the British paratroopers. The British found out they had fought these same SS men in North Africa, Sicily and Normandy. Mistreatment by the Germans was punished by their commanding officers, who knew this was the best occasion to show the world that the Germans could actually be chivalrous. Major Gough told all prisoners that they had to make a good impression, so when they were lined up to march off, they were all facing right, and they left with their heads up, shouting "Wah, Mohammed!" for one last time. The failure of 30 Corps to arrive at the bridge in time made Operation Market Garden one of the biggest defeats by the Allies of the entire war. But the bravery of the paratroopers is still remembered to this day in the Netherlands, especially in Arnhem and the surrounding region. The bridge in Arnhem is now called the John Frost Bridge, in honor of the commander and his soldiers, many of whom gave their lives in an effort to try and end the war by Christmas in 1944. If there's anything about the fighting in Arnhem that I didn't mention and you know about, if you have any questions, if you have any remarks about this video, please post all of those in the comments. That's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.